my favorite stories in the New Testament is the one Steve just read for us out of the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus encounters 10 men who were afflicted with this dreaded disease of leprosy. Now, this illness was a chronic, infectious skin disorder whose victims experienced pain and horrific discoloring of their flesh. In its advanced stages, appendages like noses and ears and fingers and toes, and even sometimes feet and hands would just rot and fall away. Since there was no known cure, the only way society knew how to deal with those who had the disease was to banish them from any contact with other people. So they often lived in their own areas called colonies, and they just totally disassociated themselves with everyone else in society. But all that changed one day, the day that Jesus came within shouting distance. And through their chance meeting and the response of one of the men, we are better able to understand the meaning and the significance of words such as thanksgiving and gratitude and healing and wholeness and even faith itself. This will be the second in a month-long series of sermons called Heartfelt, in which we will look at the questions that Jesus asked those with whom he came into contact. Because, quite frankly, Jesus had this very unique ability to go right to the heart of the person and right to the heart of the matter. Last week, we looked at blind Bartimaeus, and Jesus asked him the question, "What do you want me to do for you?" Sounds like a rather obvious question, considering Bartimaeus' condition. But we found out that it actually goes much, much deeper than that. It's a question that we should answer too. Well, we wonder, what is it that God can do for us? What do we want him to do? So this morning we're going to look at another encounter, and we're going to look at another question. And I'm going to point out something to you that I know in this familiar story, it's a temptation to just jump ahead because we know the ending, but I'm going to ask you to listen for a different nuance this morning, one that we may not have talked about quite as much, and that I hope will be a blessing to all of us. But first, let us pray. Oh God, just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and as thou bidst me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come. I come. Amen. Picture, if you will, this morning, 10 men dressed in long, muddy robes, making their way off the well-traveled road back to their caves in their huts of humiliation and shame. 10 men who had the misfortune of contracting the incurable disease of leprosy. Anytime they came too close to a healthy person, Levitical law dictated that they had to cry out, "Unclean! Unclean! Unclean!" which prevented anyone from coming into contact with their grotesque bodies, which was called grave death. But on this particular day, like it was with blind Bartimaeus last week, Jesus just happened to be coming in their direction, no doubt preceded by people who sought his attention, as always was the case. These 10 men, we could be reasonably certain, had at least heard rumors about Jesus, how he healed the sick, made the lame to walk, the blind were made to see. And they probably had heard stories about Jesus, and now I can only imagine that their hearts beat faster as they realized this was the same teacher, this was the same rabbi coming in their direction. And maybe they thought, maybe just this once, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to ask Jesus for help. So they waited for Jesus to get into shouting distance. That's as close as they could be allowed to get. But instead of crying out, "Unclean, unclean," they shouted, "Jesus, have mercy on us." You can only imagine the penetrating stares that they received from the people who were with Jesus. How dare they? in their despicable condition, call out to the Master for help. The nerve of them to think that Jesus would take the time to even speak to them. But with instant sympathy and sensitive ears and a compassionate heart, Jesus stopped. And if you were here last Sunday, you remember we pointed out that Jesus always stops when someone cries out. One voice in the crowd cries out. Jesus always stops. Then he goes over to where these 10 men who have leprosy were, and he just looks at them and he says to them, "Go, show yourselves to the priest." Knowing that Hebrew law dictated that the priest was the only one who had the authority to restore them back into a society that had already kicked them out. Go, show yourselves to the priest. No doubt one of them asked, "What did he say?" And another one said, "He wants us to go and show ourselves to the priest." And another one probably said, "Is that all Jesus is going to do for us? We won't even be allowed in the temple courtyard, let alone be seen by a priest. Why can't he just perform a miracle like he's done in all these other cases? Why would he just send us away without a blessing or even a word of comfort and hope? Is that all? Go, show yourselves to the priest." But with obedience born out of both despair and desperation, they had no choice but to do what Jesus had commanded them to do. And so they headed in the direction of the temple, feeling all the while that this was nothing more than an exercise in futility. I mean, have you ever had that sinking, miserable feeling of just knowing that before you tried something, it was doomed to fail? You know, like trying to fix your own computer. You know it's not going to work. Call in your 12-year-old grandson or granddaughter. You've had that sinking feeling. Well, I can imagine that they had that same feeling. There's this line from the hymn, "Lift Every Voice and Sing." It's in our Presbyterian hymnal, and it's written by James Weldon Johnson, the great African-American poet, who writes in one of the verses, "Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died." Their hope to be cured, yet unborn, probably seemed to them to have already died even as they made their way to the temple. But as they got closer, the Bible says that something miraculous happened which further demonstrated the power of this rabbi, this prophet Jesus. One of them let out a blood-curdling yell, a scream that could only be described as a fountain burst of praise. In total disbelief, he tore off his muddy black robe, shouting, "I'm cured! I'm cured!" And no sooner had he said it than the others looked at their flesh, their skin restored, and so they tore off their robes in jubilation. It was unbelievable, but it was true. All 10 men no longer bore the marks of this cruel disease. And so, overcome with joy, they all ran toward the temple to be pronounced clean by the priest. Now, unless you instinctively criticize the mind based on what you know happens next, they did what they were told. They heard the word and they obeyed the word. So they were doing things right. Off they went. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9? 9? Only 9. Because there was one who returned to Jesus and with undiminished gratitude started back in the direction of the village where Jesus was, and he was a Samaritan. He was a Samaritan. Don't lose sight of the fact this guy was already an outcast. He was already a foreigner. He was already not welcome in the region of the Jews, because you know the Jews and the Samaritans and the kind of relationship they didn't have. So he was already an outcast. And now, added on to that was the fact that he was a leper. So this particular man, a member of a despised race of people with a despised disease, who had the wherewithal to take a step away from the sin of ingratitude and from the sin of forgetfulness, goes back to Jesus. As the 9 obediently went their way toward the temple, this one moved in the opposite direction. And when he found him, he fell on his face, level to the ground, in unashamed thanksgiving. This man who had been cured fell on his face, thanking Jesus. And I could just see Jesus looking for the others. Here's one. Were there 10 men? Where are the other 9? Wait. Are you the only one to come back to give thanks to God? And then Jesus said something you've got to hear. And this is where I switch over to the NIV from the New Revised Standard Version that Steve read. This is where I go over to our NIV. Because Jesus said, "Rise, go your way. Your faith has made you whole." Listen to that. Listen to it. Your faith has made you whole. In this Greek version, we come to understand a hidden yet profound lesson. Unlike last week where Jesus told blind Bartimaeus and has told others, "Your faith has made you well," he tells the leper in this particular translation, "Your faith has made you whole." And the Greek word used here is sozo, for totality, for rescue, literally to be saved. It's the same word that was used with the woman who had the blood issue when she reached out and touched the hem of Jesus' garment in the crowd that day. And Jesus looked at her and said, "Go, your faith has made you whole." Sozo. In the case of the man with the withered hand that Jesus healed on the Sabbath, and last week's Bartimaeus, the Greek word is huges, which translates as heal, make well, restore. Now, make no mistake about it. All 10 men were healed. But because the one returned, praising God and acknowledging where his blessing had come from, Jesus pronounced his faith had made him whole. All 10 were healed, but only one was made whole. If you don't remember anything else I say this morning, please remember this. There's a big difference between being healed and being made whole. It's taken me years to find out what wholeness represents. What all of us, I believe, are looking for in life. Wholeness means being made complete, brought into the fullness of life, not only for now, but for all of eternity. When you've achieved everything that you desire and something is still missing, you need to know that's called wholeness. When you haven't achieved everything that you have desired in life and you're looking for what's missing, it's called wholeness. When you're unable to even name what it is you're in search of, but you know you need something, that something is called wholeness. When that emptiness lingers inside and you don't know why or from where it comes, it's called an absence of wholeness. Wholeness, friends, represents the great aha moment of life. It's when all the threads of this crazy, mixed-up life come together and form this beautiful tapestry of God's creation called you and me. When it all comes together, it signifies a peace that the world can't give you nor can take away from you. That's what wholeness is all about. The one who returned to Jesus shows us that wholeness is how our souls are enriched through the act of gratitude. And gratitude is one of the ultimate expressions of our faith. In short, wholeness happens when we go back to the source of our blessing and we give thanks. Dante Rossetti, the British poet and painter, once said, "The worst moment in an atheist's life is when he feels grateful and has no one to thank. Well, these days we aren't always very good in showing our appreciation to God. We live in a society that seems to just drown in the sense of entitlement, in a sense of me first, in the sense of what's in it for me, in the sense of it's got to be about me, it's all about me, it's got to be about me, and maybe, just maybe, if there's a little bit left over, it can be about you too. No wonder we're spiritually bankrupt. You see, we're healed, but some of us are just not whole. Casualty of being spiritually bankrupt is we look fine on the outside. Oh, we look good on the outside. But on the inside, we know that something is wrong. We have this game face we put on for the world to show that we're okay. We're okay. And it says that we're healed, but at night, when the game face comes off, we know deep down inside when we're alone that something's not quite right. Something's just not quite whole. As I was putting this sermon together this week, we got the news about the suicides of some very public and well-known people. We went through one locally here ourselves in the last couple of weeks. And I got to thinking about what that says about being healed but not being made whole, of looking good on the outside, of smiling and laughing all day and going home and crying all night. That there's an emptiness there that can only be filled when we go back to the source of our blessings and give acknowledgement and thanks and gratitude for what we have. And at some point feel content with that and feel filled with that. We close with this in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 8. God issues a stern warning not to forget Him. When our houses are built and the things we own multiply, don't forget God, it says, who brought you out of the wilderness and gave you water that you did not know of, gave you bread, manna from heaven that you did not know of, and in the end did you good. And when you get to the 19th verse of Deuteronomy 8, it says, if you do forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and serve and worship them, I solemnly warn you that today you will surely perish. Friends, what I've discovered in my life, you don't have to die in order to perish. We perish little by little each day when we worship the gods of convenience and greed, when we worship the gods of pride and self-importance and neglect, when we forget to express our gratitude to the God who has given us everything that we have. It's time to go back. It's time to remember where it all came from. So if you can declare this morning that you are looking for wholeness, if you can go back and you can acknowledge the source of your blessings and be content with that for today, and then tomorrow, then like the Samaritan leper, fall down on your knees and simply say, O Lamb of God, I come. I come. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.